If you're somebody that's making a guest appearance on a podcast, or maybe you just started your journey and you're starting to get on more podcasts and you want to learn some tips on how to become the best guest for every podcast that you hop on, today I'm going to give you those insights on how to make sure that you just become the rock star guest that every podcast host wants on their show. Now, some of the things you got to remember, some of these things I'm going to bring up, you may not even ever think about. We manage about 20 podcasts roughly, and I see a lot of really great content, and I see a lot of really poor content. And a lot of it is based on if the podcast host is doing interviews, it's based on the guest themselves. And some of the stuff just doesn't look good or sound good, or just the appearance of the guests themselves, the way they carry themselves and that sort of thing is just not proper etiquette. So I'm going to be talking about like podcast etiquette and that sort of thing. But the other thing that we got to be thinking about is it's not just about you being a good guest for the host. It's about you being a good guest for the host's audience, because they have an audience that you are about to speak to, and you're basically getting on a platform. Let's say, for example, the podcast that you're about to hop on has 100 listeners that come to listen to this podcast episode. Well, you think about it. If you're at an event and there's 100 people at an event, typically you want to be squeaky clean. You want to make sure that you have a great presentation. It looks good. You're going to make sure your hair's combed. You're going to make sure you look good, wear your best sneakers and that sort of thing. But I see all the time where people will hop on these interviews with podcast hosts and literally just almost not even care. Like, they'll take the interview while they're outside and walking. They'll take it with their AirPods in. They'll take it in the car and that sort of thing. And guys, just don't do any of that stuff. I'm going to give you the best insights here. However, I'm not going to be forcing you to like build out a studio and get like a $10,000 camera setup and that sort of thing. But there's simple things that you can do to just make sure that you become the best guest for your host and for the host audience, so that you can represent yourself and your brand very, very well. So the first thing you really need to think about is listen to the podcast that you're about to get on. Listen to a couple of episodes, at least like skim through them and get a good grasp on what the podcast is about, what the guest typically, or what the host typically does on their podcast, type of person that they're talking to. Now, I'm just going to assume that the podcast that you're scheduled to be on is within your realm of audience. So, for example, if I'm getting on a podcast as a guest with somebody, then I'm going to make sure that they're in the real estate investing space, and I'm going to be talking about marketing on that show. The audience should be interested in that. If a dentist asked me to come on their podcast to talk about my story and that sort of thing, I may be able to provide some sort of insight on social media content and that sort of thing, but that's not necessarily my audience. My audience is real estate investors. That's where I focus. So you really need to be thinking about that. Make sure that the podcast that you're getting on, first of all, matches up and aligns with who you are marketing to in your actual marketing, because this is marketing. And make sure that you know about the podcast itself. Listen to it, consume it a little bit, listen to 1 or 2 episodes and just see how it goes. This is very important because when you hop on, you don't want to be blindsided and that sort of thing. So put a little bit of effort into it. Okay, so the next thing is tech. Now, I want to get into this very quickly and give you guys some of my pet peeves. Some of my pet peeves when it comes to the tech that people use is, number one, do not use your AirPods as the microphone. You can use it as the speaker so you can hear, but don't use it as the microphone. You can get something very simple like this microphone. It's a plug-in USB microphone that you can take. You can get smaller ones that are very portable and that sort of thing that you could literally set up on your MacBook or your PC or whatever, and it's just plug and play. Get something, invest in this. If you are going to be on more than, say, 1 podcast a month, you must get a podcast microphone. And it doesn't have to be anything complex. You can get a really good $20 or $30 podcast mic, and it sounds decent. So invest in that. Audio is very important when it comes to recordings, and especially on podcast recordings, because you got to think people are going to be listening to this with their headphones or listening to this in the car. And nowadays we have audio softwares like my team can clean up audio to make it sound really good, but it obviously does help a lot when you have good audio from the start. So invest in that. Second thing is the video portion. Now, if the guest, if the host is doing a video podcast, which normally they are going to, make sure that you actually have a decent webcam at least. Now, what I like to do is use my camera for this, and I invest in this because I'm on podcasts very frequently and I create a lot of content. But the other thing that you could do is if you have an iPhone, you have a MacBook, you can actually use what's called the continuity camera setting in your phone and use your iPhone as the webcam for your computer. So look that up. I can even link a video to that down below. But that is a very easy way to get really, really good video on your recordings if you don't have a professional camera that you could tap into or a really good webcam. The other thing is just make sure that you're set up in a place that's quiet. You don't have screaming kids. You don't have barking dogs. You don't have chirping birds behind you or loud vehicles that on a busy road. Just, it doesn't have to be soundproof. Just make sure that you're in a quiet spot, whether that's your home office, whether that's in your actual office or whatever it is. Just be aware of that. The worst thing in the world for podcast hosts is getting a guest on where they're constantly having to stop the interview because stuff's going on. Additionally, on the video side is just make sure that you are centered properly. Don't be having your camera feed like this. If you're listening right now, I'm slouched way down. I see this all the time where people leave an insane amount of room between their head and the top of the frame, and it just looks terrible. On the video editing side, the reason why video is important is because now they can actually take clips and segment those into social media clips as well. But it's hard to do that if the video looks terrible and you're all the way, your webcam is tilted up. You guys know what I'm talking about. Also, lighting. So you don't have to have any kind of crazy lighting kit in order to get good lighting. You could very simply just be facing a window or get a simple light from Amazon that's $15 or whatever and make it face you and look good. So that's one thing that you could do as well. So when it comes to the audio and the video and that sort of thing, just invest in it a little bit and just make sure that you are being conscious and courteous when it comes to the tech side of things. All right, now that we got that out of the way, once again, it's important to make sure that you are representing yourself well and your brand well, and just make sure you invest in the proper equipment. Again, you don't have to have any kind of crazy setup. The more you're on podcasts, I would invest a little bit more into the tech side of things. But if you're going to be kind of a frequent guest where you're just maybe once a month or something like that, just invest in something decent, okay? So just make sure you do that. The next thing I would say is have something ready that you can send to a host that's got your bio, a few topics that you could talk about. I leave mine on a notepad. You could create a PDF and have something really nice designed. I see a lot of people have a one-sheeter where it's all their topics, their social media, all that kind of stuff. Just have that kind of stuff ready because it really does help the host be able to interview you well and actually be able to promote you a little bit more thoroughly as they're going through the podcast, ask you questions, highlight your expertise and that sort of thing, which is why you're there in the first place. So have something ready to go. You could honestly have ChatGPT whip one up for you. So just do it that way. So the next thing is make the interview engaging. So basically what I mean by that is I've had guests on my show where they literally just would give I would ask them a question. I would spend a lot of time asking the question, clearing up here's what I mean by that. And then the guest would give literally a one-line back, and that was it. There was no open conversation. There was no dialogue. It was just basically a one-line answer, and that was it. That's the worst kind of guest to be. Make sure that you articulate a lot. There's a fine line between talking too much and talking too little. Make sure that you give enough information, but still make the podcast conversational between you and the host. Every once in a while, you'll have a host where they just spit the question out and then they're not looking for conversation. That's fine. But if you have somebody like me, if you get on my show, I'm going to want to converse with you. I'm going to interrupt you during your answer if I have a question about something you just said, even though you're going into the next thing that you're saying. So make sure you keep it conversational, keep it engaging, because that's also what the audience listens for. They're looking for that type of dialogue and conversation because maybe they're not able to have that conversation with you, but the host is. So make it engaging and make sure that you're giving as much information as you can there, but don't be short and sweet and that sort of thing. And you don't have to draw it out either, but just make sure you're being thorough with your answers and be conversational. Another thing on that note too is it's actually a really good idea for you to set up any analogies that you have or good examples, illustrations, stories, step-by-steps, stuff like that is really good to have on hand. I have quite a few of those things that I have at my disposal. If somebody asks me a specific question about hey, what's your step 1 through 3 in order to be able to get started with content? I can actually here's my 1, 2, 3 answer. So have those type of things ready to go. And obviously if it's something in your wheelhouse, you should know that kind of stuff inside and out anyway. So just have something ready to go for you. Okay, so now on the interview, the host should give you some sort of an opportunity to introduce yourself. I actually don't allow my guests to do that on my show because what happens is if I allow somebody to introduce themselves, even if I say spend 60 seconds introducing yourself, more times than not, the guest will actually spend 10 minutes introducing themselves. Now we're halfway through the episode, and Nobody wants to hear that. What I always say, if I'm on a podcast as a guest and somebody says, introduce yourself briefly, I'll say, let me keep it short and sweet. I try to typically keep it under 90 seconds max because I have a pretty long story. However, I can tell people, go to my social media if you want to learn more about my full story, or go to my podcast, or go to my YouTube channel if you want to hear about my story, or my website. Those kind of like plugs will allow you to kind of amplify your reach with the audience, but then it allows you to get straight to the point when you're on the show itself. So don't give this long-winded answer. Condense it into like 90 seconds, preferably like 60 seconds. Make it short and sweet, and then allow the rest of the podcast to articulate any other further stories that you have throughout the interview. Again, the host is also going to be probably plugging you in some way. I, at the end of my episode, allow the guests to say like, hey, what's the best way to connect with you? Or do you have any programs that people can buy into, any kind of coaching or like a course or something like that, a book, and allow the guests to plug that. Have that ready to go. But if you're the guest, don't jump right into like just being a salesperson on somebody's podcast. That's the worst thing. I've actually interviewed people like that before, stopped them in the middle of the interview and said, hey, we don't do that here, because they were literally just pitching the whole time. And I didn't run the episode, even though I tried to go back and interview them again. That kind of stuff happens. So just be careful with that. Do not just pitch yourself the whole time. Allow it to kind of happen organically and naturally as the host interviews you throughout the podcast. And of course, like the last thing while being on the interview, just be yourself. Bring good energy. Make sure you're engaging. Make sure you're excited and that sort of thing. Bring a lot of smiles, because it's going to be showing not just on audio, but also on video as well. And just be ready to be just a good guest with these items in hand. Then last but not least is the post interview. So now after you've done the interview, the host will normally say like, all right, here's when this episode's going to go out, or I'll email you with some assets when the episode goes out. When the episode goes out, be a good guest and promote it for them, because now you're going to be drawing your audiences back to their podcast and intertwining the two audiences together, their audience, your audience, and it just creates this good circumference of basically exposure. There's literally nothing but good things that can come out of that. Obviously, considering you were being a good guest, you answered all the questions correctly and that sort of thing. Now your audience is going to be able to tap into them, and they're going to be able to maybe potentially learn a little bit more about you through the interview that you were on. So promote the podcast episode. It helps the host. It helps you. It's just a win-win all around. So that's my tips for being an excellent podcast guest. I am going to do another video on being a good podcast host. So if you are a podcast host, make sure you do check that out as well. But that's what I got for you today. Hopefully this helps somebody if you're going to be starting on your podcast guest journey. I do think it's a great way to collaborate and meet new people, tap into new audiences. And I actually have another video called Audience Hacking. It's a great way to hack into other audiences normally for free, and you're being put on a platform that's already been built, that sort of thing. So hopefully this helps somebody. If you have more questions or any other concerns or things that you want me to address specifically, feel free to reach out to me on social media, Facebook or Instagram. I'm Josh Culler. You can find me there. Just search my name. I am verified. Send me a DM and say, hey, I found you on this video and I have some questions. Other than that, if you haven't already, make sure you have subscribed to the show. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya.